Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to invite you to take your seats, please. I would like to welcome you to this event on the humanitarian #MeToo moment. Where do we go from here? My name is Prügl. I'm the director of the Gender Center here at the Graduate Institute, and I'm very happy that we are able to co-sponsor this event with IRIN News. The event addresses a difficult topic, sexual harassment and assault, that has become evident in organizations and agencies engaged in humanitarian work in recent weeks. The topic is difficult in general, but it is perhaps even more so in a sector that has as its goal to help those who are facing hardship and war and disaster, that has a self-understanding of being involved in a moral enterprise, that typically thinks of itself as occupying the moral high ground. As the revelations of the past weeks have shown, the humanitarian sector is perhaps not so different from other sectors. It thrives on the same patriarchal power relationships that structure private businesses from Wall Street to Hollywood and the political arena. But #MeToo expresses the fact that these power relations are no longer hidden, that victims of harassment and assault are no longer willing to suffer quietly, but are speaking up and thus making visible sordid and demeaning practices that have long gone as normal. It is perhaps useful to recall some history here to recognize the importance of this uprising. Only 50 years ago, we did not even have a word for what we call today sexual harassment. In the humanitarian sector, sexual exploitation and abuse became a topic in the 1990s, as did sexual violence in conflict. I recall here the Yugoslav wars, not only with their genocidal application of sexual violence, but also revelations of peacekeepers entangled in sex trafficking, exploitation, and abuse, often of minors. And now the issue seems to have come home. Sexual exploitation and abuse, if I can use that terminology, happens not only in the field, that other place where all kinds of bad things seem possible, but it is happening in the very organizations that want to provide assistance to those places. The blow to humanitarian legitimacy, I think, has been huge. And we're privileged today to have a panel of people directly concerned with this issue to help us shed light on it and find a way forward from this moment. We're also privileged to have a skilled journalist, Heba Ali, to moderate the panel. Heba runs one of the world's leading sources of original, field-based journalism about humanitarian crisis, irinnews.org. IRIN amplifies the voices of those affected by conflicts and natural disasters to drive more effective and accountable responses by the international community. It is one of the world's only news outlets specialized in covering the emergency aid industry. A Canadian-Egyptian multimedia journalist, Heba spent 1 decade reporting from conflict zones in the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia before moving into management. Her work for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the Christian Science Monitor, Bloomberg News, and IRIN, among others, has taken her to places like Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Chad, and Libya. and she received a grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting for her work in northern Sudan. Her recent TEDx talk, Stop Eating Junk News, you should really watch that, drives home the importance of responsible journalism from crisis zones and of creating an appetite for complex stories. She's a regular commentator on humanitarian aid policy and her published work in governmental briefings and at conferences around the world. So I would like to invite Heba, please, to come to the stage together with the panelists and give you the word to introduce people. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The sound is okay? Yeah, there we go. And thank you, Lisa, for, I think, a very useful step back at the long view on this issue. I think for those of us who've been following recent developments, it feels as though this is an unprecedented moment, which in some ways maybe it is, but there's a long backstory. And for many, I think this feels like a bit of déjà vu. As a news organization specifically dedicated to covering the humanitarian sector, we've been watching, of course, with interest. We have also been contributing to some of the stories that have gone on to make headlines around the world. My colleague Ben Parker broke the news, for example, that the man at the heart of the scandal that beset Oxfam in Haiti, who was organizing sex parties with local women, had in fact been dismissed many years earlier from another NGO for similar misconduct. And in fact, you'll hear from one of the people who reported him in a few minutes. This moment, I think, has been quite dramatic. It has led to resignations of UN executives and NGO senior management. It has led to a reduction in funding for aid organizations that are doing some pretty critical work on the ground. And it has led to a real questioning of public trust in the sector overall. And I think we may not have seen the half of it yet. As one of the panelists told me in the lead up to this discussion, the sector is still very much in denial about how many people are behaving like this. And yet it isn't, as Lisa said, the first time we've seen this kind of outcry, dating back to the 1990s, and more recently with Ban Ki-moon saying that this kind of sexual abuse was a cancer in the system, and yet we seem to keep coming back to this. So what we're trying to get at today is go beyond some of the reactive, not only media headlines, but also policy making that has been sparked by public outcries and not necessarily by deep looks at these issues. Some of the media coverage has, of course, encouraged this by being sensationalist, by conflating different issues. On one hand, we're talking about workplace harassment. On another hand, we're talking about rape of underage beneficiaries, and everything's kind of gotten lumped in together into one. And there has been undeniably some manipulation of this issue by those with an anti-aid agenda. So I think the stakes are quite high, and what we hope to do today is to break some of that down and have a more nuanced and constructive conversation about the way forward. So I'm going to start with Fiona Smith to my left, who is the head of policy, humanitarian policy, advocacy, and campaigns at Oxfam GB, which of course has been at the center of this for the last few weeks. It's been a very tumultuous time for the sector, in particular for Oxfam, and many NGOs have said this has been a painful but needed moment of reckoning. As someone who spent years advocating for women's rights, what was it like to suddenly find yourself in an organization that had so dramatically failed in that mission? And now that the dust is settling a little bit, what's your reaction to the past few weeks?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting us here today. And I think it would be absolutely impossible to overestimate the impact that this has had both on Oxfam and all of the staff within Oxfam as well. We were hurt, angry, betrayed, and incredibly sorry that we had let down the people that we were sent to serve in Haiti. And it's been sort of a bit of an emotional roller coaster, but I think it's really important to stay focused on the people of Haiti, not about us and how we feel. I think there's been an incredible amount of learning in the last few weeks, and I feel very sure that this has been really engaged with at the most senior level, and that the steps which have been taken, such as tripling the amount of money that we're spending on safeguarding, putting together an independent whistleblower service to make sure that people do not feel conflicted about coming forwards, and recognising that this is a culture that needs to be challenged. It's not simply about putting the right processes into place, although those are incredibly important. It's also about making sure that everybody in the organisation can feel safe and secure, and that most importantly, that the people who are at their most vulnerable when they're in crisis have got adequate ways to actually come forwards and say if they feel that they are being exploited by humanitarian personnel. So it's sort of one of those times when you think this has been really painful, but a very necessary wake-up call to make sure that we get it right, because Oxfam is, in my opinion, obviously, a vast organisation, but it does really important work. And I want to be part of making sure that we can continue to do that work.
So I want to turn now to Hannah, next to Hannah Clare, who has spent nearly a decade working on safeguarding issues and most recently investigating sexual abuse and exploitation within Oxfam. And many of you may have seen a rather well-circulated video with her predecessor, Helen Evans, who said quite publicly that Oxfam's leadership had not responded to warnings about this over the years and had not prioritized in the way that Fiona, you say, is now happening, this kind of safeguarding work. Hannah recently left Oxfam, actually this month, and has now joined the Norwegian Refugee Council to head up their safeguarding work. But Hannah, I guess I want your take on this. I guess what the last few weeks have been like for you, but also when you look at how this was handled on the whole, what takeaways you have?
Very, very big questions to answer. Again, thank you very much for having me here. I think the last few weeks have been incredibly challenging, as Fiona's has. I would echo what she said about how it's felt to be in the organisation. It's been challenging for my team and I, in particular, because I think we have, it's fair to say, felt under-prioritised. As Fiona shared, some of the initiatives that have been put into place in the last few months, particularly since October, indicate clearly that this could have been prioritised more in the past. But I would also say it's been a moment, for me at least, of reflection. I think for the wider sector, as Heba, as you introduced the session with, we still haven't landed our feet on the ground enough to think about how we make sure this doesn't become another 2002 scandal when we saw the birth of the protection from sexual exploitation and abuse movement. It's been an incredibly trying time, but it's, if nothing else, completely confirmed to me that what I do for a living is both necessary and valuable. And I want the voice of practitioners, but more the voice of survivors, to be heard more.
Why did you resign?
Oh, good. I have to make it absolutely clear, I was given a wonderful opportunity with the Norwegian Refugee Council, who were really keen to understand and more about how to do this work, but to recognise that they haven't done enough themselves. I think I took this work in Oxfam as far as I could take it. It's very different. It requires a very particular kind of energy and focus to begin this kind of work. And I followed on from Helen Evans's excellent start and many others before her, including Yo Winder and Lucy Heaven-Taylor. And all of us have shared our own unique challenges in the role, but I think it requires someone who can come into this with new energy to take advantage of the situation now. I was disappointed by the initial response in October, which felt quite defensive, but uniquely had this opportunity. There are very few jobs like this in the world to try and test the model that we've worked really hard, where thousands of us have invested in Oxfam, in a new context. So I think there are lots of reasons there.
So we'll try to get into some of the obstacles, including, why leadership, in your view, didn't listen to the warnings that were made. And I don't want to zero too much into the Oxfam case in particular, because what we're here to do is actually to take a step back and look more broadly. But I do want to come back to you, Fiona, on one point, which is that there were many implications, obviously, of this, and one of them was to the pocketbook. It has prompted reflection and policy development, as Hannah said, but how deep are the financial implications of this for you as an organization?
Just going to look at my notes. So I think it would be naive to say that it hasn't had an impact. Things are going to be quite tight for a while. Within the first 10 days, we had 7,000 of our supporters who give money every month leave, and really rebuilding our trust with our publics is going to be very challenging but very important for us to do. And really having that conversation with them about the challenges that we face, but also it's really important that we get it right. But, also having said that, we're all in this together, and that includes the donors as well. And we really want to work with them to make sure that we can get these systems right across the whole of the sector, because this, the challenges are sector-wide. Yeah, not great at the minute, but the thing that really worries me the most is Oxfam's the only organisation that's actually responding in some of these places. So North Aturi, for example, in DRC, we're the only people who are there. So as we reach, the end of our funding, it's quite likely that the people there are the people who are most likely to suffer. So it's, a really difficult time.
The challenge of then punishing those that are meant to be at the heart of all of this by cutting funding to organizations like Oxfam is a very real one, and we'll come to Jeremy in a moment. But first I wanted to turn to Avril Benoit, who is head of communications and fundraising at Doctors Without Borders, MSF, because I think there's a lot of parallels. Soon after the news emerged of the Oxfam scandal, while many other NGOs, I think, stayed silent and were frankly quite happy to let Oxfam take the fall, MSF did come forward publicly and make a statement acknowledging that this was a problem in its organization as well, and reporting on the number of cases that you had experienced. Did you pay a price for that transparency?
Well, put it this way, for us it wasn't the external pressure on us that compelled us to just be very straightforward. MSF has a long-standing history that you might know of just telling it like it is. And we also take great pains to listen to what's happening at the field level in our operations. So in fact, last June, there was an International General Assembly motion, and this is really, we're an association. It was a vote, and the word was coming up from the field that the organization's mechanisms, which have been in place for 15 years, all the efforts that we've been making, were somehow not addressing the issue enough. And it was a vote that was carried. After that, more efforts, more meetings, more statements, internal efforts. Even before the Oxfam scandal broke, a journalist from Reuters had asked us, as they had asked other organizations, how many cases did you have? And we had already decided that if we were asked, we would be very straightforward about this, because we wanted people in our organization to know very clearly that you can be fired for this, and that we investigate, and that we have mechanisms if you feel you can't report it up the hierarchical line. So after we got the question from Reuters in November, we waited for the story, and nothing happened. And it was only finally published after the Oxfam thing broke out in the news. And then we had numbers out there, and we thought, whew, okay, that's good. So far so good. We've been disclosing our numbers. We're along with a few other organizations, 5 or 6, that did that. But then we realized, wait a minute, there's no frame around this. So we put up a web statement. And that web statement, here's what we're doing, here's why we take it seriously, here are the mechanisms, here's the general message. That was framed by some media as breaking news, MSF fires this many people, as if this was a scandal for us. And for us, it was not a scandal, it was just a way of being, very straightforward. So you had headlines like, first Oxfam, now MSF. And so the reaction from some donors seeing that and not clicking through to our web statement, it turns out they don't, was in Spain, for example, we lost, in those initial days, 2,500 monthly donors, just in one country. Now, I'm happy to report that in many other countries, Switzerland, US, UK, we did not lose so many donors, just a small, small handful. And in fact, many offices decided to reach out to their donors and say, you may have heard about what's going on in the news, here's our statement. And the donors thanked us. They wrote back saying, yeah, I'm disappointed to hear that you have this problem too, but I appreciate that you're being straight up with us. Whereas other donors, the ones who canceled, seemed very shocked that what was a society-wide issue was touching also the organization that they had put up on a pedestal as heroes and saints somehow. And that's not how we feel comfortable being placed, in the mind's eye. We don't want you to think that we're any better, more perfect than anybody else. In fact, if anything, we're constantly telling you how we're imperfect in facing challenges. So for us, it's been a lesson in how a certain kind of way of turning the story, of torquing those headlines, of clickbait in the social media world, where you're just trying to get the maximum hits, no matter how bland and banal the information is when you finally click through to the story, how that can have an influence on people who have then a knee-jerk reaction and judge negatively an effort to be transparent.
I would push back on that in saying it's not clickbait if it is shocking and horrible that this kind of thing happens, even if it's a common thing in every sector. Is it unreasonable for there to be an expectation that humanitarians hold themselves to a higher standard? And this response that I think some agencies have had, which is, we're only human, and this happens everywhere, and we're no exception, does that cut it when you're trying to gain public trust for a sector that's so in the public eye, and where that question of hypocrisy becomes very relevant?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, because the nuance for us is that we do hold ourselves to a higher standard. We should hold ourselves in this sector to a higher standard. We're working with crisis-affected populations who are already suffering greatly. We're there to help. And as a medical organization, we have medical ethics that come into play, and the most common aspect of that is do no harm. So yeah, we should hold ourselves to a higher standard, and no, we're not perfect. So we can't expect people to, on the one hand, hold us to a higher standard, but it's an impossible standard. So there will be times where we fail each other, and where we fail the communities where we're working. And that's what the reporting and all the internal communication and all the efforts over the last 15 years have been about. And what this Me Too moment, or Aid Too in the aid sector, has done for all those efforts that are well underway was to put a bit more urgency into it, to have a look at, are we resourced enough? Are we looking enough at the mechanisms we have in place for communities themselves to complain about any incidents that may occur? So, I don't think it's in any way satisfying to say, well, we're human and we make mistakes and we have predators in our organization. That's not at all acceptable to us. We hold ourselves to a higher standard, and I don't think that those are incompatible statements.
Jeremy, I want to turn to you now, because we've been talking more about the individual donors that the likes of MSF depend on, but of course the big institutional donors have also, in some cases, had knee-jerk reactions, and we've seen DFID threaten to cut funding on a huge scale for many of the biggest British NGOs. Jeremy, of course, is the former head of the US government's humanitarian response, the Office for Foreign Disaster Assistance. He's now a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C. But as someone who spent 4 years under the Obama administration making decisions about $1.4 billion in funding, what's an appropriate donor response in a situation like this?
I think it's a delicate and difficult line that donors are walking right now. You can see, I think in some of particularly the UK reactions, there is a very sincere and deeply held substantive desire to get this right, but there is also immense political pressure that they are under to be seen to be doing something.
Rightly so.
And rightly so. And I do worry that some of the initial reactions risk scapegoating some individual organizations for issues that are actually sector-wide. They're systemic issues. They're not unique to any one organization. But I also worry that it risks punishing the organizations that ironically have been the most transparent. I've worked for NGOs earlier in my career. I've dealt with cases like this earlier in my career. I can tell you there are very few NGOs that would have documented the problems as thoroughly and as introspectively as Oxfam did. And because of that lack of documentation, would never have gotten into the storm that Oxfam found itself in. And likewise, would not have been, like had MSF not chosen to be transparent, they would have not potentially have lost those donors. So I think we should be transparent. We should be, and donors should be holding organizations to, to account for their behavior, but they should also take care not in effect to be penalizing the most transparent organizations the most. And I think there's a risk of that. So, with my former donor hat on, what I would want to be doing right now, first off, view this as a shared priority, not something that just sits on the NGOs. So, in the same way that, say, donors approach fraud prevention, and during my time at USAID, we dealt with some very high-profile cases of fraud amongst NGO partners in Turkey. We didn't view that as a case where the only problem was on the NGO side. We also took a hard look at ourselves to say, look, we should have become aware of these things sooner. We should have been monitoring more closely what partners were doing. And so, yeah, there were a number of measures that we required our partners to take, but we also had a number of internal reforms that we took because this had to be dealt with as a shared problem. And I think that's important. I think that's a direct parallel to what we see here. The challenges with effective internal reporting on sexual misconduct by staff have a lot of parallels to the challenges with internal reporting on financial misconduct by staff.
And how do you incentivize more reporting as a donor?
So I think if we look to the financial misconduct sector, you lay out some fairly detailed best practice principles that you expect your partners to adhere to. You don't say you will institute this system, but you do say your systems have to meet this standard. I think it's tricky to say to a partner, here's the reporting chain we will require you to put into play, because it's going to look different within every organization, but you do want to make sure that there is a minimal level of best practices, not a minimal, but like a kind of baseline, maybe it's a better term, level of best practices that every partner has in place and can speak to. And then there should be some, I think there should be some sort of a reporting requirement. I think the idea of requiring that every partner disclose on an annual basis how many people have been terminated for this would be useful in a couple senses. It would get out into the open that this is actually a widespread problem. Part of the reason it is traditionally so challenging to report is a sense that someone is really sticking their head above the parapet if they talk about this because it is such an in-the-shadows issue. More transparency about how frequently this occurs would help to pull it out of the shadows. It would also, as a donor, give you a better sense of where the problems lie, not just in the sense of, oh my God, this organization is having far more cases than all the others, but one thing we would see sometimes in the fraud sector is an organization would, in a very high-risk environment, would tell us, oh no, we've had no incidents of fraud. And that was a huge red flag, right? Because you knew that it wasn't that they weren't suffering instances of fraud, you knew it was that their systems weren't catching it. And so I think there is value in greater transparency and a much more robust dialogue between donors and partners on what systems those partners have in place.
But that puts the onus on the donors not to punish those who do have big numbers, right?
Well, I think to understand what's driving those numbers, you know, if you have an organization that has a poor, so again, I think the parallels to the fraud system are really interesting. What we saw in Turkey, and I can't go into a lot of specifics on this, but we saw a pretty direct tie between the robustness of partners' own internal systems and the speed with which they caught instances of fraud and the thoroughness with which they were able to root those out. And so, you know, you can, it takes some time to get to that point, and it will take some time to establish a more robust set of best practices on this, but it's possible to get there.
I want to come to the audience, if someone could bring a mic down to the front row, please. Because on this question of donor reporting and requirements, ICFA, as you may all know, an NGO consortium based here in Geneva, has been pushing a movement of less paper, more aid, right? That all of this reporting is dragging down aid organizations and making it harder and harder to actually do the operational work on the ground, but also making it harder and harder for local organizations to meet these reporting requirements in a push for more locally driven aid. So I wanted to turn to Ignacio Packer, if I can, the new executive director of ICFA, just for your thoughts on this question of, you know, in the wake of this, these scandals, what have been the implications in terms of NGO reporting requirements, and are they reasonable?
Yeah, well, thank you, Iba, and hello. I think it's about the impossible standards and at what cost. So of course there's the financial costs, but there's also the cost on how we operate. It's not about large INGOs and the UN agencies. Oxfam is top of the class today. And there are some other INGOs who have put in place policies, codes, and so on. We can talk about leadership. We can always talk about leadership. I've been leading an INGO before my position here at ICFA for 17 years, and I've always put 3 to 5% of my time directly on this. I've seen go by 100 allegations, and that's normal. But as very well you presented for MSF, you put that out in the media and then it's turned into something different. So the question of trust, and the question of trust with donors. Now what is going to happen with the diversity, and that we have to figure it out, with the diversity of actors in the sector. So, okay, the larger INGOs may be able to recruit competent people, are going to have the pressure, put it on. What happens to the smaller organizations? What is going to happen to the requirements of the system on NGO fora or on small national organizations? Does this mean that suddenly everything is going to be on the ones who are going to be able to support the requirements that are coming from the donors, the pressure from the media? One important thing is that, and I feel even the larger INGOs are making commitments that they're not going to be able to uphold. And we really have to be very careful in our sector not to take commitments that we're not going to be able to uphold. Because if not in 15 years' time or in 5 years' time, we're again put on the scene. We have to be very realistic. Zero tolerance doesn't mean zero risk. And we would always have a number and a great number of cases. In my spare time, I also work in safeguarding in sports. I'm on the advisory board.
In your spare time?
Yeah.
Right. I didn't realize that was a hobby.
No, it's a cool position as ED in ICFA. Have an incredible team that does all the work. You know. As on the advisory board for human rights of FIFA. So this is also the question that it's something which is. And it's not to bring it to say, okay, we can excuse our sector, but it's all over in different sectors, and we have to reach out to different sectors to learn from them. It's about the integrity of our different organizations. I don't know if anybody listened or watched the debate last night on the Swiss television, which is around what's going on here in Geneva, around education. Okay? So it's also good for our humanitarian sector to reach out to other sectors who are also struggling. Because if we've been trying to put these systems in place for over 15 years, we're still not at it. In 15 years' time, we will still not be at it. We have to improve, but I think someone said also the time factor is so important. And perhaps just yesterday we had our General Assembly at IGVA, where IGVA is a network of over 100 members of, and more than half are national organizations or national networks. And the element of saying, how are we going to be managing this diversity with also increasing donor requirements on many things, but including what's going to happen here? Is humanitarian action just for a few who are going to be able to offer themselves the systems and the dream that we're going to reach these standards?
So I'm going to just delve into this question of reporting a little bit, because I think a lot of the failures that we have been talking about over the last few weeks are linked to it in one way or another. And I'm finally now going to turn to Amira Malik Miller, who currently works at the Swedish Foreign Ministry, but had direct contact with the man who was at the center of this whole scandal many years ago in Liberia. Roland, and I can never pronounce his last name. You'll do it better than I can. No. Okay. Van Houwermeyen, thank you. So you worked with him for the NGO Merlin in Liberia in 2004, and you were ultimately the person who reported what you saw then as misconduct to your headquarters at Merlin, and actually succeeded in getting some action in the sense that he was then dismissed, although he then went on to work for Oxfam, and you all know what happened next. But in one way or another, the system kind of worked in your case in terms of reporting. But I understand, there were a lot of rumors about this guy before you had gone to Liberia. People had kind of heard about him through the rumor mill, and informal attempts at reporting his behavior had already been made in the past. So what made it work in your case, and what can we learn from that, do you think?
So yeah, that's true. Thank you for having me as well. I heard rumors about him when I was in London for my briefing, and I very not just about him, but about other people as well, I should say. And I got down, and this incident happened 2 weeks into my posting, I think. I think and I should say that what I reported wasn't directly connected to him, it was another person, but it was clear that there was a group of people involved. I think that maybe what is to be learned from my case is how I reported it. I reported it in a very formal manner. I wrote to headquarters. I said that I wouldn't expect that, I wouldn't I wouldn't tolerate this, and I would leave if they didn't do anything about it. I don't know about how other people did report it, but there was something about maybe how I did it that made people listen. So maybe that's something that can be learned. You do it in a formal manner, and if I had to do it today, I would probably document a lot better than I did then. I would probably also disclose to other people, independent mechanisms, unions or an ombudsman or something, who could help me to track what happened, but also protect me as a whistleblower. So because you are in a very vulnerable situation, absolutely.
And I think we've seen in some of the recent comments, actually, by the deputy head of UNAIDS, of all people, who called those who reported sexual assault to be total liars, and created, I would imagine, an environment in which a whistleblower may not feel very comfortable coming forward. How would you describe the environment for whistleblowers?
I mean, my experience has been quite positive. I always felt that I was listened to. I have been able to be open about it all the way through, and this is something that happened quite long ago, but I've been open with it. And now when this all came again up in the media, I didn't think it was such a big deal to again come out or come out with my name even. I didn't expect the attention though. I didn't expect this the media coverage and how difficult it has been since. But to me it wasn't such a big deal. And yet you were one of very few who actually came forward. I expected others to come forward, I have to say. So if anything, I would, on the whistleblowing, I mean, there's an issue there of creating a collective response to these kind of statements, that kind of make whistleblowers continue to be very vulnerable. We need to come down hard on that, and there needs to be a systemic, system-wide response. There needs to be inter-organizational responses to that. But I would say for individuals as well, I feel that we do have a responsibility to speak out when we can. I understand that there are so many reasons for why you cannot and where you put yourself at risk and so on. But if you can, and often, as international staff, we're often in a better place, I feel, to speak out. And we have ways of doing it and mechanisms that could protect ourselves. I would encourage people to do so. And again, drawing on the linkages you made to fighting corruption or our anti-fraud mechanisms and so on. There's an expectation for us to report, otherwise we're involved. And I think to some extent that is in our code of conduct already, and we should on an individual basis also be held accountable to that.
So one of the challenges, and where this debate starts to, the layers start to become clear, is that, as you said, as a Swedish national, you had certain protections, or you felt you had certain protections in reporting this kind of abuse. Avril, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, because MSF obviously works in a lot of the contexts that are the most difficult in the world, where reporting as a survivor or as a witness could have very serious implications. Give us a bit of a reality check on why this might not be quite so straightforward.
Yeah, as some of you may know, we've had situations of MSF being specifically targeted, attacked, violence perpetrated against us very directly. And what happens in some of the places where we work is that victims fear, as there's stigma in many parts of the world, that if they were to complain about something, and I'm talking about people from the crisis-affected communities, that they would be banished from their families, banished from their clans, unmarriageable, and furthermore, the perpetrator could retaliate against them very directly, or retaliate against the organization in a violent way. And so these are, we work in circumstances where these come into the balance. And so with all the questioning that came around, all the sector of how come you didn't fire all the people who were accused? Why don't you call the police in all cases? We had these kinds of questions. Well, our impetus and our focus is always on what does the victim want? What do they need? And we try to provide as much support for them as possible. So if it's a staff member, an international staff member, it's a little more straightforward because they will have access to the psychologist back home, they will have access to various other kinds of support. But what happens when the victim in a case that's investigated and found to be true disappears into the woodwork, then we're not able to support them in the way that they need. And if, another question that comes up around even reporting to the authorities, do you report all these cases to the authorities? Well, in some cases, you would have a circumstance where somebody who's accused of, say, sexual abuse by one victim from the community as well, can end up dead tomorrow from that person's family, or from the authorities. So, the consequences that you have to then think through a number of ethical considerations about how you're going to handle these cases, and it's a lot more ambiguous than in Sweden or in Canada, where I'm from. People make very black and white kind of statements about what the aid sector should do, and it's hardly ever so simple.
So what should the aid sector do? I'm going to turn to Tina in the audience, Tynda, who is, I think you describe yourself as a suffering gender advisor, but she's been advising governments and aid agencies for nearly 30 years on questions of gender and sexual abuse, and currently heads up the International Federation of the Red Cross's work on safeguarding and protection from sexual abuse. You advocate for a survivor-centered approach, which is, I think, what Avril was just suggesting. But for all those aid agencies that you advise who are dealing with very complex layers of gray, what is your advice in terms of how you operationalize this kind of protection and safeguarding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. I would say that my suffering is nowhere near the suffering of people at risk.
Sorry, I should clarify. Suffering in the sense that gender advisors were kind of pushed to the side and not given the priority, I think, as Hannah suggested right off the top, that they should have.
Yeah, I want to say that now with the Me Too and the Aid To campaign, finally there's a focus and even some money coming into the gender and diversity work that many of us have been doing for many years. So this is the time, people, to never do anything without talking to your gender and diversity advisor, because we have been working on this forever. And until careers depend on how we implement these kinds of measures, until that happens, I'm afraid we're going to see some slow progress. And in terms of the survivor-centered approach, we should always remember all the people who couldn't come to this meeting today. And those are women, children, youth, young men who are at risk of being abused by our staff, our colleagues, or peacekeepers, or local people. So we have to keep them in mind always. And the survivor-centered approach is to make sure to have an informed consent before we do anything. We have big discussions now in our organizations on the reporting, which this has been very much about. So we must remember that we should never report in behalf of anybody else unless we have their consent. So that's extremely important. We also should have a sensitivity training of all of our humanitarian workers, that they know how to meet somebody who has just been exposed maybe to some of the worst experiences in their life after already having become a victim of an earthquake or flood or war. So to focus on those people and to open up our code of conduct work to the people we are there to assist, it's very important. What I see in this work on preventing sexual exploitation and abuse, it's very common for organizations in our bubbles here in Geneva to think about our own reporting systems and our own investigation methods. They are important, but we could work on them without focusing on them only. So I would just urge all of us to make sure we have community-based complaints mechanisms in place where people feel safe to report. We also have to provide assistance and redress to survivors of this kind of abuse, and we have to report back to those who report to us on what has happened to the alleged perpetrator. So there's a lot of work ahead of us, just let's roll up our sleeves. And I also, on reporting, I want to compliment DFID and other donors who are now pushing the humanitarian community to work on this and to prove that we have good systems in place. They do not accept wishy-washy language anymore. I just learned that 29 UK-based agencies have been now cut off from DFID aid because DFID didn't like the response letter that they sent. So without
the response letter to
DFID has written to I think it's 170 UK
clarity on their processes, internal processes.
So they're already working on it. So now it's not only about saving people's lives after war and disaster, it's also about saving organizations. And I think it's equally important. No matter what this is about saving, it comes down to our accountability. So this is very new, that this kind of accountability is actually now happening. Because I've worked on this, as you said, for many, many years. Careers are not safe if you work on this. I'm like a walking whistleblower. And I'm from Norway, so I've had to go back to Norway a couple of times after losing my job because I have been a bit vocal about these issues, but at least I could go back and I could have food on the table and support from my family. But many of our colleagues from low and middle income countries and on short-term contracts would not be able to bring this up. So I would just say let's make contracts more steady and let's fix our organizations internally so that nobody feels obliged to, let's say, accept unethical behavior in organizations so that the contracts are safer. Because we now need everybody on deck or our organizations will not be funded, as Penny Mordaunt says. Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about how we go about fixing the organizations, as you mentioned. Because there's been all sorts of ideas now that have been thrown around, right? Renewed calls for an ombudsman. We've heard people talking about a humanitarian passport that would create some kind of magic database where offenders' names would be magically tracked. We've heard calls for Interpol to be beefing up reference checks. I've heard some organizations say they're no longer hiring single men, they only hire men in families and young women. And it's just getting to, in some cases, pretty ridiculous levels. So maybe, Hannah, to come back to you, which of the ideas that you've heard floated around in recent weeks as the solution to this are actually feasible and have merit for someone who has seen kind of on the ground what these investigations involve? What would actually make your life easier?
There's so much about what was just said that I want to respond to.
My questions are always very overwhelming.
Well, no, also I feel like there was a lot to build on from previous contributors, but I really just want to put a word of warning out there to start with, to say that I think we're all being incredibly optimistic about how many people are actually getting to the stage where they're bothering to investigate these things and have anything on paper. And, you know, it's wonderful to be considered among any sort of class of people, top or otherwise, but I certainly would not consider the progress that we might have seen in Oxfam to be anything near what I would want to see. And this is horribly underreported. So the figures that you receive from many of our organisations are like the tip of the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. So like, I don't want us to pat ourselves on the back at the moment. I don't think we should. And I think I completely agree with what Tina said about the fact that this has just been too difficult to do on your own. And so as one of few practitioners doing this, we can't continue to have to be those internal whistleblowers. Accountability and who actually is held responsible for doing this work is critical, and I completely agree. Until our donors ask us to do these things, we don't see internal investment. That is absolutely true. Oxfam has seen a PSEA team that was restructured and mainstreamed into HR, which didn't work as well as they hoped. It moved into the international programs, and then it moved into a more independent team in internal audit, which still faced its own challenges. But you know, even with the will and the investment that we've seen there, we haven't always seen the success we needed to see. And I think actually getting more support from Interpol, getting more support from each other, and working much more closely with each other would afford much better practice in reality. I think a lot of us are scared to do this work, and a lot of us have sort of found ourselves using language that we've never used before. But it's problematic that we don't use the same language as each other to describe this work. You know, we haven't sat down and asked each other how we define different categories and whether we even know what the vast majority of our perpetrating patterns actually involve. And, you know, I think there's a unique opportunity now to start really challenging very structural barriers to doing this work. And I think that's why it's so painful. 15 years ago, the sector saw a similar revelation, 16, maybe even 17 years ago, a similar revelation whereby we somehow first realised collectively that this was a problem in our sector, which had clearly been happening since the beginning of time. We operate under some of the most absurd and entrenched power imbalances that you can possibly imagine working in, whether you are a staff employed internationally or from within your own country. And there's a huge amount of status as well as financial incentive to abuse that power. And I think we have to be realistic. If you want to challenge power, you have to challenge the power structures within your organisations. And it's only when you have leaders who are willing to say, I know and I've worked with this person for a really long time, and I'm disgusted to learn about this behaviour, therefore I am terminating your contract, that there is the kind of accountability that you need to see. But I think we don't tend to challenge the really structural things and problematic issues about how we work as much as we should.
You said to me earlier, humanitarians don't recognize the power politics that they're carrying on their sleeve, something to that effect.
Yeah, not always. And I think it can be a uniquely privileged, and very often is a uniquely privileged situation to be in, particularly if you're coming into this work as an international staff member, both in terms of how you're rewarded financially for that work, but also the additional protections that many of our panellists have talked about, But indeed, also as staff being employed nationally, we've got to be realistic in a lot of the contexts we work within. NGO jobs or INGO jobs might be the only job opportunity, much less the most supportive and the most sort of capable of helping you to meet the needs of you and your family. I think we don't challenge ourselves enough around our role modelling responsibilities, frankly. And I think it genuinely is harmful. And it's much more harmful how our staff can behave in terms of the relationships we build with our communities than our leaders can ever possibly realise. When you hear beneficiaries equating you with sex tourists who come to Southeast Asia, or with only wanting to be there to sleep with our women or whatever else, you have to start asking what kind of impact that has and how much that devalues what we all believe and hope we are there to deliver in terms of assistance.
So there's a lot in that, and I think there are some who argue that, in fact, it's not just questioning the same dynamics that happen everywhere in the world in our sector, because, in fact, people are attracted to the humanitarian sector specifically because they know they will have access to vulnerable people in an ungoverned space. So this is an even more, potentially even more high concentration problem. But if we agree that ultimately the enablers of sexual abuse are racism, classism, sexism, all of the isms, colonialism, and what you're talking about is societal, cultural, transformational change that can actually get at that, how do you do that? And is it the role of humanitarians to do that? Sure, go for it. And then I'll open it up to
I don't want to speak over anyone else's time, but I think as a practitioner, the privilege I have is not only to hear from people some of the things that they may never tell anyone else, but also to be in a position where I realise this really isn't as hard to do well as you think it is. It just isn't. We just don't invest in the people who are comfortable talking about sexual violence and talking about acts of violence and saying things that people don't want them to say. And we don't invest in those traditional gender, but especially diversity conversations and specialists as much as we should. And actually, the one thing that, I've had so much privileged access to our staff across the organisation in the last 5 years in Oxfam, and I really hope to do the same in NRC. But I trained nearly 1,000 staff myself, and the one thing that we could all agree upon is that we share a culture, and that is the culture of our workplace. We all have an obligation to make that safe, but we all have some ownership of it as well. And I think this sort of speaks a little bit to what Amira was saying about, this bystander culture. And the one piece of research we do sort of seem to build upon in violence prevention is around this idea that if you're watching as a bystander, as an outsider to a situation, it probably will be a hell of a lot easier for you to raise a concern than somebody else. And if you have trained people who use a survivor-led or a survivor-centred approach, suddenly the complexity and the fear and the danger and the risk is massively reduced. And you can see really incredibly rewarding results. And we talk about a spectrum in our training as the sexual violence sector would traditionally talk about as of the last 40, 50 years, whereby if you tolerate the things that many people, it really bugs me when people say that some things are more serious than others. I think it's so harmful. And clearly one of the biggest disincentives to offer someone who might be considering telling you about something that genuinely made them feel uncomfortable. But we talk about this spectrum, and I'm really able to say, because I have over 200 cases worth of history in one organisation, that actually I've supported people who came and reported something that happened whereby someone said something to them that made them feel really uncomfortable and they resigned the next day, as opposed to somebody who we would see at this end of the spectrum who experienced rape by a colleague who continued to work for the organisation for a year after because they felt supported. So the reality is, this is about, survivor-centred work is about recognising that all of us legitimately will have different responses to different levels of risk. And as humanitarians, how often have we been asked, has your tolerance for the risk level of the work you're doing changed? Or anything like that?
a lot of informed people on stage and in the room, and I'm trying to capture as much as I can. And I'm going to turn one more time to someone from the floor and then come back to the panel and eventually get to the wider room. But because I think you've raised a few points there. One is, how do we finance this stuff? And Tynda will tell you that she's been banging on the doors of donors since 1992, is that right? In terms of saying, hey guys, this is important, and it's only now that everyone's coming to knock on your door and ask for your help. Jeremy might dispute that, but there's a question of resourcing. There's the question around, you're saying, a lot of this is not actually that difficult to do, but one of the challenges is, if you take the case of Megan Norbert, many of you will have heard, she was an aid worker, a Canadian aid worker, who was raped in South Sudan by another aid worker, and it took a week for her employer to get her out of that camp where she was working while her perpetrator was following her around day after day. And that's an HR issue, right? It's not necessarily an investigation issue. And so the functions for properly handling this at a technical level are across a lot of different parts of an organization, which make it then a challenge. And then there's the layer of the kind of structural societal challenges. So the reason I want to turn to Maria Thestrup, who heads up the International Committee of the Red Cross's team on compliance towards its code of conduct, is that the ICRC is doing a few interesting things to try to tackle those points of bringing together the various functions that have to tackle safeguarding within an organization for it to be successful, but also operationalizing culture change, if I can put it that way. So Maria, can you walk us through what you guys are thinking and trying to do?
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I mean, for the ICRC, it's been, I would say, a great opportunity to take a look in the mirror, first and foremost. It's been a rather long moment now for self-reflection, but of course also action. And I think the reality is that the deeper we go into the matter of culture and culture of integrity, operationalizing a culture of integrity, if you wish, the clearer it becomes that it's, of course, highly complex. It's obvious that there is no simple answer to these questions, but there may be simple principles, and I'll come back to that. In terms of what we've done, we've gone through the experience of having an extremely strong code of conduct on sexual misconduct since 2002. In 2006, we added to the code a strong prohibition against prostitution. We have, I think, in our DNA, facilitation of learning and role modeling, which is all extremely important to shape, I would say, a culture of integrity. And last year, before this eruption, we restructured our entire compliance organization to exactly address the point around coordination, alignment, because we all own compliance. The thing with compliance is it doesn't lie with one function or one individual. It's something that is clearly a shared responsibility. And when we recognize that, we also have to recognize the fact that it needs to be sustainable, and to create a sustainable change, it requires coordination and alignment. It really requires clarity on roles and responsibilities to the various and sometimes unpredictable situations we have to respond to. Now, in terms of operationalizing integrity, it's something that through our self-reflections, I think we have become a little bit wiser on, despite the complexities, and we see some clear attributes that are extremely impactful in shaping a culture of integrity. And I'll try to turn it a little bit around, because if we ask ourselves if the majority of our employees share a perception that everyone in our organization feels safe to speak up, is that an area we then need to tackle head on, or do we need to prioritize something else? It's one attribute. Feeling safe to speak up is a clear indicator of whether you're moving towards the right direction when it comes to shaping, strengthening a culture of integrity. The second element that we have synthesized is, do our managers truly feel equipped to respond to some of these extremely challenging situations when it comes to addressing allegations of sexual misconduct, because, as you rightly put forward, they really cover an extremely broad scope. Are they equipped with the right psychological skills to actually respond in that very moment in a way that the staff member or the victim feels supported? If the answer to that question is no, can we then claim that we have a culture of integrity?
So you're setting up kind of indicators.
So to come back to my point, there are a number, and quite a few of them, where you can go about asking yourself, what does integrity mean to us? What are the key attributes that shape a culture of integrity? And then the question becomes, how do we measure them? And that is really the interesting part. And I think we've all done it in one shape or another, maybe not with as much intent as we would do it today through staff employee surveys. We feel, do you understand the code of conduct? But have we done enough to actually ask our employees, our organizations, straightforward, do you feel safe to speak up? And what is the answer? So employee survey in many different shapes and forms is one way, but it's also about, again, connecting those functions in the organization that have the difficult conversations and ask for their perception. So, and then you could argue that there's a whole new layer to that, which would be really interesting to explore, which is, as we have done it in the past, which is to structuring our activities around monitoring. How do you monitor in your delegations whether the various attributes you have assigned to actually be the culture of integrity, whether they're strong or they're weak? How do you go about it? And for us, this is a very intriguing question, which goes well beyond having a strong policy, which goes well beyond having a reporting mechanism, which goes beyond essentially ticking the boxes that we see we are ticking today.
Thank you. I'm conscious we're covering a lot of ground, and I do want to give you guys time to kind of respond to what's been said. But maybe one last question from my side for you, Amira, is a lot of what we've been talking about is work within international aid organizations to improve their own internal procedures and policies. And yet we're in a moment in which we're talking more and more about localization, and that it should be local aid organizations that are at the forefront of delivery and response. And so are we missing the point almost in the focus of the discussion, whereby, in fact, the kind of cliche of the white man in a Land Cruiser being the perpetrator in most of these cases is absolutely not true. And a lot of this is South Sudanese on South Sudanese, or whatever you want. You know, it's a much more, the political economy is quite different today. So how does that change this debate for you?
Well, I think others have brought it up, especially our ICVA representative there. But I mean, to me, I'm really happy that this Me Too, A2, Time's Up movement comes at the same time now as we're in the middle of a humanitarian reform process, and the localization agenda is, you know, the one I would, you know, say is the most important one. But there's also ways of how we work with the development side and more long term, and how we contribute to long term goals from the humanitarian side as well. I mean, there's a real opportunity now to look at how we, within the humanitarian system, contribute to improving gender equality in the societies we work in, and that we don't transfer automatically these power structures that, you know, are so inherent in our system onto local and new actors, and that we think about how, you know, how do we empower women to take on management positions and drive decisions in the local and national context. How you know, do we enable the local organizations to also invest in strong safeguarding, protection, whistleblowing policies, and have the accountability to their staff and to their communities? We need to invest there from the donor side, the same way we're doing in international NGOs. We need to enable that investment in local organization. how do we ensure that local staff and organizations and people and ultimately governments as well can hold the international humanitarian aid system to account on these issues as well. And I think, I mean, it's fair, we do work in some really difficult contexts, but they're not all South Sudan where we cannot be nationally regulated. There are some contexts where we could be more transparent about these things as well, I think. So, you know, I really think there is an opportunity now to move on this. And the way forward, and I think this has been very silenced in the last couple of weeks' debates, is, you know, we need to consult much more with our national staff and national communities, but especially with the civil society organizations in the societies we work in, who are very strong. There's some very strong organizations driving gender equality and wanting to speak out on this. We need to engage much more, listen to them and understand the problems fully, I think. And then from there, you know, move on to solutions.
I think we should take a few questions from the floor, and then we'll come back to the panel for some way of trying to pull all of this wide-ranging conversation together. So does anyone have questions? We have a volunteer with a microphone. Nora's over here in the middle. And if you can just introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Nora, a long-time aid worker. So, like others, really pleased that IRIN and the Graduate Institute was able to organize this discussion. So I'm not going to talk about being a long-time aid worker, but what surprises me in this past discussion, which is very useful, is there's no reference to what the sector has been doing since this latest scandal. We all know, anybody who's been an aid worker, that this has been a real problem for some time. Efforts were made after 2002, and clearly not enough. The UN, where I've worked, has a zero-tolerance policy, and so what, as we saw in the Central African Republic a short while ago, and more recently elsewhere. So that's one issue that I'm surprised didn't come up, how the Emergency Relief Coordinator, for example, or is there internal discussions going on that we're just not aware of to try to come to more better grips with this? The other issue that comes up, because it comes into how to deal with allegations, that there's also instances of false allegations that merit time and energy in addressing them. And does that deflect then from addressing allegations that have substance? In other words, we know we live and work in these very complicated, quite often lawless environments, and one has to indeed be very sensitive to local political and other dynamics, whether it's about recruiting staff or firing staff, etc. So that, I would assume, is part of the overall equation, but I just haven't heard about it. Thank you.
And I think particularly in the context of all these discussions around passports and so on, which can very easily go into an area of blacklisting. So maybe we can touch on that. Let's take one or two more questions, if there are any. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm Dominic Woolsey from the Gender Mine Action Programme. We're a small NGO based here in the Maison de la Paix, and we work towards gender equality in the mine action sector, which is often a little bit out of step with other aid sectors, especially on this issue. And yeah, I just kind of, we're trying to navigate through these issues at the moment. I'm getting a lot of questions from organizations about how they can kind of improve their systems and things, but also a lot of pushback in a way, and that's what my question is about. You know, from some really absurd stuff like, you know, sex work stimulates the local economy and things like that, and you know, this is the kind of stuff that you occasionally hear, to things that are the kind of ethical question about, you know, do we have the right to be regulating people's private lives? And then you know we're sending aid workers off to places, and you're trying to tell us that they have to regulate their relationships with their co-workers and with the people that work there, and also the idea that people are coming back to us with is that the idea that everyone is vulnerable in a country that you work in, when we all know many colleagues who have are married to men or women that they've met whilst working in other places. And it's just how to approach those issues without, because we're kind of in a little bit of a gender bubble possibly with the way that certainly in mine action that people approach these these sorts of issues. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that there's not very much mention of the UN here, and I think everyone who's had some contact with that knows that there's a serious problem there, and if anyone had any thoughts on that as well. Yeah.
Great. Fiona, can I turn to you first, and maybe particularly on the questions of what progress has been done? I think Oxfam has put a lot of work into this, but also the complexity of dealing with some of these questions. And I may then turn to a few others for some of the other points.
Thanks very much. I must say that just summarised the complexity, I think, and 101 other things as well. So Oxfam has been working very, very hard, and one of the things that we have done is we've set up an independent commission which will be investigating all of the previous cases. It will report in 6 months and then finalise in a year. So that's about trying to have some degree of sort of strategic senior level oversight and accountability, because we recognise that we need to be transparent and we need to be accountable. That's incredibly important, not just at this time, but all time as well. We are going to be working on changing policies, practices and culture within Oxfam. We've got an absolute zero tolerance approach. And that zero tolerance would actually encompass all of the things that the gentleman has just mentioned here as well. But also, as I mentioned earlier, about being made to feel uncomfortable. And we're also working across the humanitarian and development sector with other organisations to prevent this from happening again, and including efforts to reform recruitment and vetting processes. For example, within Oxfam, anybody just can't give a reference out. It is going to be through strategic focal points who are actually authorised to give references. And this is to try and stop what we know has happened before, which is friends give each other references and therefore we can't track people. A colleague of mine is actually working on humanitarian passports, but as you acknowledged, Heba, it's incredibly complex. We haven't necessarily got there yet, but maybe looking at working with people like Interpol could be a way that we could approach that. But also something that has been so missing from this debate, and I'm so glad that Tina brought it up today, but also that Hannah referenced it as well, is this has happened in a context which is very much about gender justice and the fact that this is about violence against women and girls as well. And I don't think we can separate the two things. So you can't just have great processes without really trying to rebalance power. And as a feminist, I also understand that power doesn't just lie with gender, it lies with race, as you were saying, Heba, but it also lies with any number of other discriminations as well, which often intersect with each other. So we need to make sure that we are really understanding that power, really working out how we can really disrupt that power as well. And it was great to hear Amira talking about, sort of local humanitarian leadership. I know that the first responders in many of the crises that we actually referenced, and I worked on Syria for many years where there's been very, very little humanitarian access, are actually people from the local community, and particularly women's groups from the local community. So I think they really deserve our support. And I've just had the absolute privilege to spend a week with women from Iraq, Yemen, and Palestine this week as well. And they had so many of the answers. We need to really listen to them. So I think that's what this change of culture is. It's about basically devolving power to those who are closest to the ground and really supporting them. And women's rights organisations are always the poorest funded. I think something like 1% of all funding goes to women's rights organisations. So let's see how we can actually resource those people who not only need it most, but can really help to rebalance this power.
Nora, if I understood, your question was about not since this latest scandal, but over the years, what evolution have we seen? You're going to need the microphone.
So I think it's been obvious for a while that the zero tolerance policy has been not good enough, has not worked, delivered. And then more recently, I've been examining and amazed that I can't find anything online about what the humanitarian sector is doing. I've not seen the ERC, Emergency Relief Coordinator, speak to the issue.
As a result of this latest set of scandals?
Correct.
Okay. So, Avril, maybe I can turn to you for some of what MSF has been doing, but also this question from the gentleman about operating in areas where cultural norms might be different, and we're coming in with our own set of ideas about what's right and wrong that might not play the same way locally. And then we can tackle the UN and accreditation in a minute.
So I just to address the zero tolerance aspect, I think we're all striving for zero tolerance. We're striving for zero tolerance, knowing that perfection is not going to be attainable, and this is going to be something that every aspect of society, every sector is going to be struggling with. I personally am very thankful for the Me Too movement and the Balance ton port and the Time's Up and all these initiatives to draw attention to this, because what's happening, I think, for many people, men and women in our sector, for example, is that we're scrolling back into our histories and saying, wait a second, what happened there in that situation? How did I handle that complaint? How did I react to somebody saying I was being sexually harassed? Did I do the right thing? Women that I work with are saying, that episode reminds me a lot of what Louis C.K. did. And at the time, I didn't complain. And
even you yourself,
we're starting to have a heightened awareness that, wait a minute, we can't just dismiss that as he was drunk, or he was stressed, or he was almost burnt out, and he was at the end of his mission anyway, so he was going to go home as it is. I think a lot of us are seizing upon the dialogue around this, are having open discussions in our organizations that are extremely helpful. And it's a healthy process also for the men to exchange with women about what is the line. We often, and look, before the Oxfam incident really blew up in the press recently in the last months, I was in northern Nigeria, in Maiduguri, but also going to some of the places where we have projects and initiating discussions about abuse of power and sexual exploitation. And this was something because, as I say, it's been a focus of our organization to try to work better at identifying those risk factors and the behaviors that do not meet our expectations. And it's not that there was a specific case, it's just that we felt that we needed to do a better job of letting our staff know about what are the behaviors that are unacceptable and what are the ways to report it and to blow the whistle if you feel there's something going wrong. And over the course of that whole episode, you would have sometimes, the initial response from some men being, yeah, but what about the false allegations? And what I've learned, and I think a lot of us have learned from this whole Me Too phenomenon, is that hashtag is a reality. When there's a complaint about one guy that the women in the hallways are starting to talk about, you will sometimes find women saying, are you kidding me? That same guy did that same thing to me. Me too. And that's what it comes from. So I find this an extraordinary moment that we don't want to lose the momentum around this, because there have been people working on this issue diligently in the shadows, in the HR confidentiality, and that we don't talk about people, and we don't want to have rumors running rampant and disparaging people who have never been properly investigated. This is the problem with this whole sensitive question of reference checks. I mean, we have to recognize that the public is demanding of us, and reporters are demanding of us, that we keep these blacklists and practically that we post them on the internet, not recognizing how illegal that is in most labor laws. You're asking us to break the law here. These people have never been accused formally, maybe never investigated, and yet you want us to ban them from the organization. It's a very touchy area. So what I relish, in fact, in this moment is how much we're talking about it, how much we're sharing. And it's about, yes, sexism, but it's about all those aspects of inclusion. It's about acceptance of LGBT members and staff members in our projects. It's about recognizing that the diversity of our organization, which is increasingly, by the way, speaking for MSF, run by women, has to include a recognition that inclusion is an unfinished challenge. You've got diversity 42,000 employees, but you haven't quite reached that level of inclusion where people feel safe, comfortable, able to thrive. So this has drawn our attention in a more focused way toward the things that we need to fix. And I consider that not wanting to be too positive and Pollyanna about it, but I personally welcome the moment.
Jeremy, some final thoughts?
On which part?
Well, I think in particular, the question of false allegations and the challenge that poses for some of the tools that we're now talking about, accreditation of aid agencies, passport, and so on. I'm seeing you, Jacqueline. I'm seeing you. We're doing a wrap-up here. We're close to time.
All right. So I can speak to that. I think it's worth addressing a little bit about what is going on, as a result of the current moment. On false allegations, I'll just say very quickly, I'm not that worried about that, to be honest. I think if we got to a point with this issue where the biggest problem we had to deal with was a proliferation of false allegations, that would be enormous progress. I'll just leave it at that. In terms of the UN, I think the UN absolutely must be a part of this conversation. I think the same power dynamics that you see enabling this kind of behavior in the NGO sector are existing and probably magnified within the UN system. And I think it's concerning that, Sidibe's comments about his deputy were deeply concerning on that front in the message they sent to his own staff and UNAIDS and more broadly in the UN system about the kind of environment and culture that exists for whistleblowing in that organization. In terms of what's going on now, I know, so next week, Interaction, which is the US NGO consortium, will be coming out with a major letter signed on, as of earlier this week, 93 of Interaction's member CEOs had signed on to a letter laying out a very specific set of commitments that they would undertake to change their organizations and to change their sector. Much more, I think it comes from a recognition that the zero tolerance commitments that we all made coming out of the 2002 scandals were very nice in principle, but did not translate into nearly enough change, and it's time to get much more specific about what we're committing to. So I think that's a very positive step. I'd like to see something like that out of the UN as well. I think it's important that that come from the UN as well. One issue I want to touch on, just because we're compressed on time, that hasn't been enough of the conversation, I think, is how all of these organizations are governed. Because ultimately, this isn't, these are fundamental questions of organizational culture and organizational governance. If you look at the case of Justin Forsyth at Save UK, there was a real screw up by his board in terms of how they handled that investigation, and it came because he was mates with their board chair. And if you look across the NGO sector, that is not uncommon. There is a very chummy relationship between a lot of boards and the organizations that they nominally oversee, and most boards, I won't say most boards, I'll say many boards in the NGO sector exist more to promote the organization than to govern and oversee it in practice. And I think that's a real problem when it comes to fixing this problem at a level that goes beyond just what an individual CEO decides to do.
Jacqueline, can I give 1 minute last words to Amira and Hannah, who haven't spoken, and then we'll wrap it at that. And thank you for your patience. If there's anything you wanted to touch on in the questions.
I think I've said most things, but just shortly then, I think it's time to start. I mean, we've all been thinking quite short term now in terms of how organizations have responded to the last week's happenings. But I think it's time to start thinking long term now and aiming for real transformative change. And again, to repeat, I think it's time to engage and invest in local actors and women's organizations and truly build that partnership to change things.
Hannah, is this an optimistic moment for you?
Definitely. I wouldn't be in this work if I wasn't an optimist and I didn't believe that we could change. But I really, really want to say that I would like us to start listening to the people who have been struggling to do this work for a really long time. We're not very good at hearing them. Dare I say, I've not always been heard as much as I hope I would, and I take my responsibility to speak on behalf of the people who trust me very seriously. And the last thing I would like to add from an investigator perspective, with quite a significant caseload, is that I've only ever encountered 3 malicious allegations in over 200, and none of them came from inside the organisation. And I want to be really clear, there are far more people who will never tell you about their experiences than there are people who will make false allegations, and the cost is far too high for you if you do, especially in the workplace. As an investigator, you're trained to have the capacity to see a situation as clearly as is possible and provide an objective overview, and it's really clear in situations that have arisen out of some sort of miscommunication. What we're talking about is being brave enough to accept what our own prejudices are when we look at these situations and start growing. And self-awareness is really critical. Tone has to start at the top, but all of us have to be incentivized to be as good as we can be.
So if I'm to try to wrap up what I think we discussed over the last hour and a half, is that there are a lot of layers of grey in this debate that haven't always been done justice in terms of the complexity of these issues, in terms of the complexity of responding to abuse, some of the actual operational challenges, whether it's the risk of the perpetrator showing up with a gun and shooting everyone in the compound, to the different cultural norms that operate in some of the environments in which aid agencies are working. And then most importantly, I think, to the underlying challenge that this abuse takes place as part of a much wider power imbalance, and that shifting that is a real challenge. I think some of the answers we've heard today are you have to resource this effort. Tina had said once, you can't say shelter is important and then think that shelters are going to build themselves magically. And why do we think that's acceptable in this sphere? So, put the resources behind this, put it into your budgets, into your work plans, etc. I think we heard a point on governance and how the boards of aid agencies need to take their oversight role more seriously. We've heard some of the concerns around the new reporting requirements and how in particular that might affect local organizations. But I think overall we've heard quite a bit of optimism, ironically perhaps, about this being, yet again I say cynically, but another opportunity to double down in efforts to tackle this, but also a moment of awakening, I think, for those who have been fighting hard against this, that they've now got a bit more support and visibility. So thank you all very much for coming. For those who want to follow these issues and many others, you can subscribe to our daily or weekly newsletter for policy analysis on the sector writ large. We will be also putting a video of this event online so you can share it with others who might want to hear the layers of grey. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.